Welcome back to the Diplomatic Lounge once again. Today we have a somewhat longer podcast than usual because we want to touch on very sensitive subject matter, that is Israel, Zionism and anti-Semitism. In the confusion of present-day world politics, no issues are more drowned in propaganda, lies and misunderstandings than this threesome. And they lie at the very core of bloody wars, past and present, in the Middle East. They also happen to be subjects that require much historical insight, patient reflection and nuanced reasoning, and those virtues are, alas, increasingly absent from public discourse and public opinion. I feel forced to speak out about these themes not just as a diplomat, witnessing the failures of my profession at its highest tasks to prevent wars, or at least to end them honorably. There are much more personal reasons. I come from a family of the political far right, and my father was a staunch denier of the Holocaust. As soon as I developed a political conscience of my own, about the age of 15, I started to react against this environment, and I became a hater of any form of anti-Semitism. I grew up in the city of Antwerp in Belgium, where the traditional Jewish presence had partly survived the Holocaust in spite of active collaboration of the local authorities with the razzias of the SS. The survivors I saw in the 1960s and the 1970s were the lucky ones who had made it to London or the United States or transit countries and had returned after 1944 when Antwerp was liberated. Yet about 70% of the Antwerp community is said to have perished. When I was a footloose teenager in the city, I became fascinated with the surviving traditions I saw in the Jewish neighborhoods. In view of those elements of my formative years, I also became a staunch defender of Israel, of the original Israel, that is, the one of the kibbutz and the social ideals. It was only later, when I became a voracious reader of history, that I discovered the murkier aspects of the founding of Israel. How British rule in Palestine had poisoned the relations between Arabs and Jews, how a fake messianism justified a racist colonial project like so many of that era, the first half of last century. From day one, the idea and later the reality of the State of Israel was an entangled mix of idealism, realpolitik, ruthlessness and violence, and yes, racism. The British encouraged Jewish settlement in Palestine because to them, like to many, it seemed a clever idea to rid Europe for good of Jewish people. We have to remember that anti-Semitism was rife almost everywhere in Europe, not always in the same violent ways, but always ready to erupt. Neither should we forget that even the United States was unwilling to grant visa to most refugees from the Holocaust. Antwerp was a special case in point. The city had seen Jews and Gentiles living side by side since about 1900, with neutral relations, yet when the razzias and the deportations started, very few citizens helped out or resisted. The amount of official collaboration with the Nazis was downright stunning. The young United Nations stepped in with a rational plan to divide the territory between Palestinians and Jewish settlers. The plan was killed by Jewish extremists together with its idealistic proponent, the Swedish Count Bernadotte. He was gunned down in 1948 by the Irgun, the organization led by later Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Bernadotte, who had wrestled humanitarian concessions even from SS leader Himmler, failed with Begin. The main argument on the Israeli side was that the very founding of Israel was the compensation owed by the world for the Holocaust. This was used to justify the massive dispossession of Palestinian lands and properties. Encouraged by the British, the reasoning was that the Palestinians had never had a rightful claim to the land, whereas the Jewish people, scripture in hand, had very ancient rights. But although I'm an agnostic, I also read scripture. The invasion of Canaan by Joshua in Exodus is probably high fiction, but the reality of earlier occupancy of the land is not. When Christian education in Belgium and elsewhere compared the virtues of Judaism with the godless Canaanites and Philistines of the Old Testament, it took only a bit of linguistic skill to realize that those Philistines of the Old Testament were the precursors of the latter-day Palestinians, supposedly when the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. The argument that they are not the same people is, of course, irrelevant. The similarity with the founding of modern Israel lies in the circumstance that there was previous occupation of the land. A Philistine is even now a derogatory term, meaning a hypocrite and a moron. Anti-Palestinian racism, we see, has deep roots. One of the slogans presiding over the creation of Israel was land without people for people without a land. The lazy Palestinians were not just inferior to the hard-working settlers, they were simply erased from history. The simple fact remains, though, that as of its earliest history, Jewish states were based on conquest. A rule rather than an exception in all of history, but also undermining any claim of moral exceptionism. Jewish states were always just that, political entities created with lots of misery and some advantages and graces. Now, as if all of this weren't complicated enough, into this labyrinth steps the United States. Not just politicians, but also preachers. And they step in two different ways. First, comparing the very founding of the two countries, the myths of both the US and Israel, created in a no man's land, free for the taking by anyone willing to work the land and create a new world in the process. Neither the Native Americans nor the Palestinians were ever there, and when reality, that bitch, made them exist anyway, you confine them to reservations. The second intervention originated in the US is even more surreal. Christian Zionism, as it is called, US fundamentalists began to flock to the Holy Land to witness firsthand the end of times, Armageddon, and the second coming of Jesus Christ. In this view, all wars and violence are justified precursor signs of that apocalyptic end. Pass over the disturbing fact that in that form of Zionism, the Jews are seen as infidels, and unless they convert in extremis, their fate will be eternal flames. But US fundamentalists are not just a surreal phenomenon, they are an important part of the electorate at election times. Visiting the land of their perverted dreams as tourists of the apocalypse, as it were, they can mingle with some of the most fanatical and heavily armed illegal settlers of the West Bank who are from Brooklyn. All this confusion explains in good part the present-day radical opinions for and against Israel, about Zionism, the resurgence of rabid antisemitism from the river to the sea, slogans meaning erase Israel, pure and simple, and the accusations of genocide in Gaza. Luckily, there are still people making the distinctions. First of all, many Jewish people, and especially intellectuals worldwide, are against the premises on which the State of Israel was founded. The Antwerp community of my youth was and is largely Hasidic. Many of those Hasidim are still anti-Zionists. This is also the case in New York. While working at the United Nations, I witnessed more than once in the 1980s joint manifestations on First Avenue by anti-Zionist Jews and Palestinians. Their opposition to the very existence of the State of Israel had very different reasons. Many Hasidim reject the idea of a secular Israeli state. But nevertheless, they came together over it. Today, various Jewish organizations of peace activists in the US and worldwide are condemning not just its excesses, but Zionism as such. Of course, this leads to further polarization in the diaspora and elsewhere. Also, many Jewish intellectuals in the US have sound opinions on the issue. Common among them is the argument that Zionism is a main cause of antisemitism, an opinion I came to share, frankly. At the 2001 UN Conference on Racism in Durban in South Africa, an initiative of the Arab group to equate Zionism with racism practically derailed the entire conference. Today, I guess, it would be less controversial to many participants and observers at such a conference. It's with thoughtful US journalists, they still exist, and academics, that the preservation of historical and political truth now rests. It's hopeful to see that interviews and podcasts exposing the lies, the hypocrisies, and the misreadings of history find a lot of attention and viewership. But in general, in the present-day intellectual climate, the louder and uninformed voices will probably prevail. In present-day politics, the old distinctions between the left and the right have become ever more blurred. Traditionally, admiring Israel was common to the left. It was a socialist state, it emancipated girls and women, etc. When the civil rights movement started in the US in the 1960s, it was considered in poor taste or downright forbidden or reason to be cancelled to compare the situation and the oppression of the Palestinians with the circumstances of African Americans. And as is well known, young Jewish idealists joined the ranks of the civil rights movement, sometimes paying with their lives. But now anti-Semitism is almost a hallmark of woke culture, that bastard child of the old left. Many developments no longer fitting in the traditional schemes of thinking leave us clueless. Saddest of all, we have to live to see Israel behaving like Germany in 1940. Difficult to wrap one's head around, but happening before our eyes. It's a sad and downright frightening coincidence that two grand illusions of world politics come crashing down simultaneously. The idea that the United States is and will always remain a democracy by and for the people, and the idea that the State of Israel is a moral project. US democracy has been hijacked by caricature with the complicity of an increasingly undereducated electorate. I'm confident that the US will one day recover its dignity and its common sense. Israel, though, will have it much harder for the world to forgive the choices made by Mr. Netanyahu. Earlier massacres perpetrated by Israeli troops, such as in the camps of Sabra and Shatila in 1982, were still defended as preemptive strikes to prevent a new Holocaust. The argument was paper-thin then and is completely absurd today regarding Gaza. Hamas is indeed a terrorist organization, and its massacre of Israeli hippie kids remains an unforgivable horror. But there is nevertheless a vast difference between non-state terror and the state-sponsored forms, such as were set loose on Gaza. The latter are just far more deadly. Not just Mr. Netanyahu lost his soul, so did much of the once admired Israeli military, with often horrific behavior towards Gazans for all the world to see, and apparently without shame, often even with gleeful celebration. The early Israel one had to admire and to defend in spite of the complicated circumstances of its origins will probably be gone for good. What we are left with is the bitter reality of an overarmed, aggressive, ruthless, and yes, racist state. It remains true, nevertheless, that Israel is the only democracy in the region of autocrats and new rich oil money with all the consequences of ostentation, bad taste, and de facto slavery economies. The only hope for the long road to moral recovery is that the Israeli voters take matters in hand and send Mr. Netanyahu packing. Like for many others around the world, though, and in spite of my background, it will take a long time for me to regard Israel positively, like I regarded it as a teenager. We will come back to these issues in a next article and a next podcast, trying to see them from a purely professional diplomatic perspective, asking ourselves where can Israel and where can the region go from here. Lots of subject matter to think about. I hope this thought-provoking podcast finds sufficient echoes to join other voices that speak in the same sense. Till then, thank you and goodbye.